It's a real pleasure to have Gilles Retsin from London with us this evening. I probably should preface by telling a brief story how the two of us met. By the way, for those of you who don't know who I am Evan Douglas, the Dean of the School of Architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I was the external examiner for the Bartlett, I think for three consecutive sessions, which was unusual, Gilles. I believe there's a maximum number of two, and Frederick Migaru, the director of the program, obviously he appreciated my contribution. and as a educator, practitioner, and the head of a school of architecture, it's always a pleasure and it's and an honor actually to be able to participate in any form of collaboration and discourse with other schools of architecture around the world. This is something I urge my faculty to take on, and that is to leave home and to essentially participate in a wider circle and to get the kind of objective distance to be able to see what kind of research and modes of production are taking place around the planet. And I have to say that the post-professional degree program, the MArch program, which you now direct at the Bartlett, I think is really one of the most exciting and innovative research programs in the world, and has been for a number of years. At some point in the last visit, or maybe second to last visit, there was an exercise devised by Frederick, which was to essentially take the classic 1967 Panton chair, designed by Vernon Panton, and use it as a build box, as a virtual build box within which each of the design studios, and if I'm correct, they were collaborative design studios because you were working with Manuel Jimenez Garcia. You basically had to occupy that build box using robotic technology and more or less addressing it according to your project of the Discrete, so that there was this massive agglomeration of elements, pieces, particles, bits, certainly self-similar, but the amount of intricacy and redundancy and obsessive incremental adjustment was startling. And although the ghost of the Panton chair was always present, that it seemed to me that one of the challenges was to figure out how to supersede it or create a dominant system that moved Panton well into the distance, right? It's almost like when you become a master of techniques, you don't want to foreground the techniques, you want to foreground the thesis and the message those techniques are in pursuit of. And I thought the research coming out of your studio in particular, Gilles, was not only brilliant, but it felt fresh. It felt, and I've been in the discipline for many decades. So I'm kind of I'm dating myself, but as a young man, I saw the deconstruction come in, and certainly we can fast forward parametrics in the paperless studios at Columbia. And in each of these moments, it was as though the earth shook. And something novel, however awkward and strange and unresolved and problematic it might be, you just got a sense that there was a certain level of authenticity that was taking place down on the ground, pedagogically, and in relation between the teacher, mentor, and the students. And of course, those chairs have gone on in their own right. In a way, they've become classics. Not in the traditional sense, meaning that they embody a kind of paradigm shift. And I think it's testimony, well, to your creativity and to your intellectual rigor and your commitment for looking at something that maybe is a kind of roadmap to a new era of architectural production. And so, since that time, you and I have kept in touch, probably not as much as we'd like, but I knew that I wanted to bring you to RPI and share your gifts with the school. So a few words about your practice. The beauty of architecture as a lineage is that every new generation of architects builds upon the legacy of invention inherited from the previous era, while always honoring the radical discoveries of the past as a productive form of intellectual grounding. The more novel and creatively astute architects like Retsin are always obsessively curious about the next school of thought that has the capacity to alter architecture as a deeply meaningful design, cultural, and political practice. His extraordinary research on the discrete promises a fundamental reassessment of the entire production chain of architecture, from initial design conception to the physical assembly of buildings. Drawn to the synergistic opportunities afforded today computationally between the organization of virtual information and its corresponding avatar as actualized matter in the form of an array of interlocking building components, Retsin's unique vision of the discrete proposes the way in which architecture becomes a form of democracy through the design development and mass production of self-similar building parts that are endlessly interchangeable, offered as an explicit critique of the parametric that favored absolute surface continuity, the iconography of the building as a hyper-figurative object, and mass customization as the ideal means of production. The discrete, posited as the antithesis, proposes a bottom-up strategy, the amalgamation of its parts as a kind of sublime incompleteness, and the mass production of highly efficient building components through the use of standard automation technology as a more effective economic strategy to reach a global audience. His unique theoretical position and exciting corresponding design proposals represent the underpinnings of a new paradigmatic shift for a discipline, with important design, political, and social consequences for the greater population. A brief overview of his background. Originally from Belgium, Retsin is an architect and designer living in London. He studied architecture in Belgium, Chile, and UK, where he graduated from the Architectural Association. His design work and critical discourse has been internationally recognized through awards, lectures, and exhibitions at major cultural institutions such as the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Royal Academy in London, and the Centre Pompidou in Paris. Retsin won first place in the competition for the main installation of the Tallinn Architecture Biennale. He's also qualified with his proposals Budapest new National Gallery and a concert hall in Nuremberg. Really extraordinary projects, by the way, and we look forward to seeing them tonight. He recently edited an issue on architectural design AD on the Discrete and has co-edited robotic building architecture in the age of automation with the detailed Verlag. Retsin is a program director of the M-Arch Architectural Design at UCL, the Bartlett School of Architecture. He's also co-founder of Design Tech Consultancy and Research Lab, AUAR, which does high profile research into new design and fabrication technologies. It's a real pleasure to have Gilles Retsin with us tonight, and we look forward to seeing the beautiful work and having a conversation afterwards. Gilles, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Evan. I actually, I have a slide in my presentation that I actually gonna skip to start with. That's my first chapter was called Great Expectations. So after this introduction, there's great expectations and a lot of pressure here to live up to this incredible intro. Thank you so much, Evan. And I was just, the advantage of this online lectures is that we can, pull up also things like Facebook. So I just found actually a picture here of Evan and myself, 5 years ago. It was actually 2015, Evan. Together with Matthias Del Campo here in the bar to discussing the work and the chairs that Evan was describing are these ones, this kind of series of very, very strange Phantom chairs that were 3D printed at the show there. So yeah, this was quite. I actually haven't looked at this picture since. In a while. Yeah, this is also Evan looking at the chairs here in the Bartlett exhibition. Yeah. So anyway, so the talk today, I'll just go into full screen. I'll set a timer so that I don't keep you forever. I mentioned to Evan before that usually when I go to the US, I'm extremely jet lagged by the time that I have to do my lecture. This is almost the same. It's like 12 o'clock at night in London. So similar vibes, a lot of coffee. So the title of this talk is just Discrete Architecture. I was thinking about other titles, but ultimately that's what I want to discuss with you, that premise of this Discrete Architecture that Evan actually just also brilliantly, I think, summarized. I just made a whole sheet of notes from some sublime incompleteness I wrote down, hyperfigurative objects, like very nice terms. The lecture itself is split in 3 discrete blocks. The first one called Great Expectations, the second one, Irresponsibly Naive, and the third one, 99%. This chapter, roughly speaking, the first chapter is about architecture. The second one is more about technology. And the third one is about the kind of socio-political premise. Usually my lectures are the reverse. I start with a kind of almost a kind of cross-section of the current context that we inhabit, explaining where the work comes from and what it promises, and then I show the work. And then usually I run out of time and I can't talk about architecture. I can't kind of go into the details. So for this opportunity, I have for the first time switched around my lecture. So we will just start in a way with a kind of architectural journey, I think, and I'm going to try to go quite in detail there. Then we'll talk about technologies, and then we'll talk about the premise. So also this is an experiment. We'll see how that goes. So why Great Expectations? One of the things is, I graduated in 2008 from my professional master's in Belgium, and that was probably until recently the worst year you could graduate as an architecture student, because that was also the start of the financial crisis. So there were literally no jobs, and everything, all the exciting, parametric, technologically experimental work that we had done in architecture school, somehow, that was impossible to practice that. after 2008. However, this year, my graduating class this year of 2020, I would dare to say, is probably even in a worse kind of situation. So it's interesting that the practice, my kind of professional life has played out until now between this kind of two big moments of crisis. More about that later. So the work that has really developed in that period between 2008 and 2020 is framed around the paradigm of the discrete. It's been summarized in this issue of architectural design, which was in a way a bit premature. Like it was not a kind of a retroactive book, but it was a very active book. So it was written in a way before a lot of the work was materialized. The community of people in the book were still actively developing the work. So the book had this kind of, it was almost kind of a catalyst for the work, and it's still being developed. And it's now, I think we started it in 2017, and then it was published 2 years ago. So in the meanwhile, this has developed quite a bit. And I think what is unique about it is that it really tried to gather a group of people, and that's also something I think quite interesting to consider, that the discrete is not a kind of, I mean, on the one hand, it's super personal for me as an architect, but on the other hand, it's also a project that is shared with other people who have added arguments, who take maybe also even quite different positions than I take, right? But it's in this kind of conversation with all the people in this volume that this work has developed and is still very actively developing and shaping up. And the discrete, in the meanwhile, it's very strange because it went quite fast in a way. Like now, if you ask Pinterest, like this is me kind of looking for discrete architecture on Pinterest. So even Pinterest now, the algorithms know what discreteness looks like. So if you trust Pinterest, it looks like this, right? Purely kind of, you know, aesthetically or in a way how this machine learning algorithms have categorized it. So it looks chunky, it looks maybe fuzzy, it looks blurred. There are definitely no continuous surfaces. There are no kind of defined superforms. It's maybe a bit moody and a bit dark as well. You know, all in the opinion in a way of Pinterest. We see also work here of other practitioners like Casey Rem, who I believe was also for a long time at RPI, now at SoA-RPI, or people like Daniel Köhler. I want to kind of start a little bit to kind of give a few tools to understand like what the discrete is and how we should discuss it. And so in a way, like you could understand the discrete as purely from a kind of data perspective. It's a mathematical idea how to organize data. So analog data is continuously differentiated. It has no parts. So the equivalent would be an analog clock where a mechanical dial moves around in a circle. So there is no precise digits, but it continuously differentiates. It's analog. And then the digital is data that consists of discrete bits. So the digital and the discrete are inherently linked. Not everything discrete is digital, but everything digital is based on discreteness. So that's a kind of like a boring, maybe very boring slide to start with, but I think it can take us quite far. Of course, it's an absolutely naive and perhaps stupid idea to try to divide all of architecture in two polarities, being either discrete or continuous. You know, it doesn't really make sense to do it, but a lot of these kind of things maybe, you know, are productive to do. The discrete and the continuous are, I think, in architecture, that debate has always been there. It's a fundamental issue. It's not a kind of radical dialectic. At some point, depending on how you look and analyze projects, you will always kind of discover a relationship as well between the discrete and the continuous. But just for sake of the kind of the polemic and the argument, we are going to do a very polar division in architecture. We'll divide it in two parts. It will be either continuous or discrete. So what you see on the left is a typical example of a continuous analog building. Beautiful shell by Felix Candela. This is a building that consists of one part. It's therefore also just a whole. It has no subcomponents. It has no parts. It's cast in concrete, right? So it's just a kind of one large object that you create. It's also finite. It's completely defined by a finite superform, and it cannot ever expand. It's completely finished in time. It can also not ever be partially built. You need to build it all at once because it needs that kind of super form to hold up from a design perspective, but also from a structural perspective. The building on the right by Van Eyck, the orphanage, is a very different building. That's a building that is discrete. It's not digital discrete, but it's a discrete building. It consists of parts or modules that aggregate together. And the building, you can easily imagine that it could expand over time, that it could contract. You could even maybe disassemble it and assemble it in another form on another location. Both, by the way, modernist, kind of key buildings from the modernist era. But you could also go further in time. And I kind of made this up first as a bogus argument. Like I never did research into these arguments, but I made up this argument that architecture in the West had been traditionally continuous because of the fact that it was largely built out of stone. Stone is very heavy. So the only way you can create larger holes with stone is if you rely on geometry and form. If you want to build with stone, you need the form of the vault to range to be able to build in stone. And then you can of course go to the Gothic, etc., etc. And then architecture in the East is less reliant on geometry, on this kind of universal ideas of geometry. And the argument goes that it's partially because it's built of timber. Timber is a material that works in both tension and compression, and therefore there's much more freedom and fuzziness in how you can position it. You can cantilever, you can escape kind of geometric superforms. And the building on the right here, this Japanese or Chinese temple, is cannot purely be understood as a geometrical form, as a topology, or as a surface. It's actually a volumetric aggregation of self-similar repeating parts. So I launched this argument to a proper architectural historian, to Mario Karpel, who then promptly told me that I was right. So this is now an official historic argument. And these are just some more, just like subtle hints, traces of discreteness, just to show that kind of idea is so fundamental and so old. So this is an image I really like. It's basically a Froebel block version of Union Temple by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is, I mean, an image that is extremely important now in the meanwhile for my work, because it has this kind of bluntness, this kind of monumentality, this kind of straightforwardness, primitive aggregation of the work, of the design. Of course, Frank Lloyd Wright, is you probably all know this project, the textile block project, which in a way is also a nice precedent for the discrete, because it consists on one hand of a series of states, extremely beautiful and unique villas, but at the same time had the premise that it could become a construction system also for larger groups of people, and that it could even be designed or other architects could get their hands on these blocks and also design with it. There's also more obscure references like Alfred Bemis, who was a kind of crazy scientist operating at MIT in the 1930s, who wanted to standardize all of architecture based on a kind of a cuboid or a voxel, we would say today, and developed this kind of super interesting voxel-based construction systems. Then more recently, people like Philippe Morel, who already in the early 2000s designed this kind of ArchiZoom, Alfred Bemis-like universal house that consists of pure pixel-like modules. This is the kind of more vulgar explanation maybe of the discrete. So, if you would, as a child, if your parents would have given you toothpaste to play with instead of Legos, then you would operate in a continuous analog paradigm. You would be extruding toothpaste to build, little towers or little structures. You would be operating in a continuous space without parts, and you would always be constructing a single whole. If your parents, like probably most normal parents, would give you Legos to play with, you would have operated in a digital paradigm, actually. Like even as a small child, you would have been confronted with a digital discrete, because Legos have a limited set of connection possibilities, almost like precise bits and pieces. You can only position them on those limited connections. And every structure you would have built with Legos would always kind of be in part whole. It would always be a kind of an complete whole. You would be engaged in circular economy. You would be assembling and reassembling your Lego blocks, and you would be developing design paradigms on top of these Lego blocks. That would be your unique positions as a child. So the strange thing is that somehow as architects, we have operated in the two-space paradigm when we were working with robots and with digital technologies. We have never really operated in the Lego paradigm, in the digital paradigm. So although this is a robot, that is programmed with a series of pretty difficult instructions, it is actually continuously extruding a material that is analog. So ultimately, this is a robot engaged in an analog operation rather than in a digital operation. It receives its instructions from the top down. This is ultimately, just as Felix Candela, his shell that we were looking at in the beginning, this model has a finite state. It can never be reassembled, or we need to break down the clay again to its kind of basic particles. And this is a bit of a confusing one, and one of the last ones I want to show. You can try to guess with me, is this now discrete or is this continuous? So it's a brick wall assembled by robots. It consists, of course, of discrete bricks. However, these bricks, the final outcome is actually continuous. These are bricks that can be positioned with a continuously differentiated connection. They can be rotated 360 degrees, just as an analog clock in a way. There's not as in a Lego, there's no finite connection possibility. And the position for all these bricks is derived from the top down, from a mathematical equation that gives the instructions to these bricks. So these bricks do not derive their positions in respect to each other, but they derive it from an overall geometrical model. And then also structurally, they are connected to each other with mortar as a continuous, equivalent of two space, right? Now, why are we talking about these things? And that's a little bit kind of maybe the great expectation. So the interesting thing is that while discreteness and parts have been around in architecture for ages, and the conversation with modularity, or the disciplinary discussion of part-to-whole relationships, we have not ever really thought about part-to-whole relationships or about architectural parts in a digital way. So we have worked with discrete elements, but we have not necessarily considered them as digital parts. I will explain that a little bit further, like what that actually means. But that is an exciting discovery, because in a way, it's a creative question. So in a way, when Colin Rowe was analyzing his famous essay, when he was analyzing Villa Stein by Le Corbusier and comparing it to Palladio's villas, he was making the argument that we had never been modern. That actually Le Corbusier's villa was just a white stucco or concrete version of Palladio's villa. We were still relying on the same geometrical grids, on systems of proportions, and on elements that had specific functions like columns, walls, grids, etc. So fundamentally, we had not yet been modern. We had not been able to separate form from function, which then, of course, Peter Eisenman, his career was founded in a way on the attempt to disconnect form from function and to break that kind of modernist assembly. And that is interesting because in many ways, like I have been obsessed by this model, which is the idea that Le Corbusier, his Maison Domino, that it's extremely resistant and extremely difficult to get rid of, right? This kind of original model, which we could argue is not even modern, that model is still persistent in architecture. So, and there are kind of reasons for this. Like this is another one of my made up kind of blunt histories that are very wrong, but also I think entertaining. So this diagram is showing the entire history of architecture, at least in the West, where if you would look at really alt, you would be in a kind of an pure assembly of parts, and then you would be in a kind of moment where you would be stuck kind of in stone construction between solid walls, and it would all be based kind of on the wall. And then what the domino did was flip that inside out. Like I always say, the domino flipped architecture inside out. It got completely rid of the wall and everything became above the floor. And that persistent model is still there. It underlies kind of still most of our architecture today, or it affords us to do what we do today. So this is another one of my historical diagrams, which contains architecture history in the last century, where you see the domino, and then you see the attempt to get rid of the domino with postmodernism, where we try to diffuse the domino with figurative elements. Then we see Peter Eisenman's attempt, the decon attempt to get rid of the domino. Then we see the parametric attempt to get rid of the domino, where we clad it out in a way with curved panels, or kind of to give the impression that the domino is gone, but it's still lurking behind the surface. And then maybe a more recent, very much in the US actually, the kind of triple O object-oriented ontology paradigm, where we try to make, in a way, a building appear as a kind of autonomous object. But again, if you look on the inside, we'll see that it's kind of afforded by the domino and kind of sliced into a series of layers. So in a way, as a kind of a young architect, when you enter into that scene and you want to make a difference, you need to do something that no one else has done. You need to do something that has not been taken. And for me, when I started, you know, when Evan met me in a way at the Bartlett, when I was just teaching, I think that was my very first year, and then my second year teaching, it was obvious that we could not do anything that I had learned at the AA, or follow any of the kind of the projects that, in a way, the people that, you know, I studied with and admired and that I had all the books from. We could not do that because it would not be, we could never compete with that. We could not compete with a project of curvature or a project of superform. We had to do something that has absolutely nothing to do with the expectation. And that is, in a way, I think, if you look at all art and maybe literature, that's kind of what happens. That there are great expectations of, like, the moment that something maybe reaches its high point, its kind of technical summum, then a next generation would kind of dismiss the kind of the expectations and the description of that technical summum. For example, if you look at like a high Beaux-Arts painting, they would paint the most technically perfect and incredible paintings, and then someone like Cézanne or early generation impressionists would come along and would just paint technically, like, you know, they would dismiss the entire technique and just rewrite kind of the rules. So that was a little bit the attempt in architecture, to do this kind of shocking move to say that it's not anymore about form, it's not anymore about the super whole, it's no longer about geometry, it's no longer about mass customization. From now on, it's only about parts. And then in that diagram, that's kind of the diagram that shows the discrete, and it's deliberately a provocative diagram, where we have a series of parts that are all the same. They don't have any function or precise meaning, that somehow are articulated in a form that looks quite similar to the domino. Yet the argument is that this is not a domino. The argument is that this model, this like stupid diagram, is more radically different than the domino, than any of these attempts. All these attempts have never managed to get rid of the domino. They've tried to diffuse it, they've tried to hide it, they've tried to kind of wrap it into objects. But actually, this attempt gets rid of the domino. There is no more domino. There is just an aggregation of parts that are always the kind of repeating parts. There is no floor slab, there are no columns. So this, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see that little mouse hand? Otherwise, I need to describe that. But anyway, so the column that you see here is not actually a column. That is actually the same element that appears here in the horizontal plane. So ontologically speaking, everything in the diagram on the right is different from what you see on the left. So we got rid of the domino. So that means that we need to design. The premise of a digital discrete part would be that the part has no function, no prescribed function, that it does not, that it always remains autonomous, and that in a way it never derives its position from a super whole. It will always derive its position just locally, and it will always remain discrete and autonomous within an assembly. And the kind of, the premise is then basically that while doing that on that journey, that you could get rid, and we'll talk a bit more in the next chapter on technology. We'll talk a little bit more about that you could also then get rid of this kind of terrible world that the domino has brought us into, right? So the domino has flipped architecture inside out, and it has given us a kind of a world of commodified building elements, of curtain walls, of commodified, terrible PVC window frames, and a kind of a building industry that is an incredibly slow and old-fashioned world. But more about that later. So what does that look like? It could look like this. So this is the first project in a way that I started working on that approaches the discrete. So that's in 2015, if I remember that well. So roughly at the same time as the chairs that we were looking at. And this project, it's called the Rockhut, and it consists completely of repeating arrow-shaped elements. And it was a kind of a naive premise, basically. It started out, it's a project in Belgium. It started out with a former classmate who became a climate consultant and therefore earned a lot of money. And he approached me and was like, I don't know what to do anymore as an architect. Can you please design a villa for me? And he was asking it like in a way jokingly, because he knew that I was just graduated from the AA and teaching at the Bartlett with robots. So it was more like a kind of a teasing kind of question rather than taking it seriously. So I was like, yeah, sure, we'll give you something, and it will be based, essentially the argument was it will be based only on a kind of hyper-rational argument of a single repeated part. You will not actually have to pay for any kind of crazy customization. We'll just prefabricate that one part, we'll aggregate it, and you will have your villa there. So we made this huge model. We cast a few thousands of these pieces. And the argument was then that everything that you see here in white is that repeating part, this repeating arrow element. Everything in red are kind of customized zones. So I mean, it wasn't entirely like as radical yet as it could be. So the argument was like, look, 90% are these white parts, and you will have to pay a little bit extra for these 10% zones that maybe we need to customize. But ultimately, it's a very rational proposition. So this repeating elements would come together on these customized parts, which still, by the way, I mean, it's more like a complex Lego in a way, like they still use the same modular connectivity, but they in a way allow us to kind of switch or flip grids. So this is one of these strange chunks from that model. This is Nathan and Manuel working with me on kind of establishing that massive model in the office. And then the kind of resulting architecture, I mean, it's something that is still, I think, until today driving my practice. And that's why I really start with this project, because I think the kind of premise that this model contained is really powerful. Like it showed in a way that you could work with seriality and with serial repetition, ultimately, but that you could push it away from the kind of boring, modular, hyper-rational and cold project that normally we associate with modularity and seriality. It showed also that you could bypass geometry and topology and surface, but that it could become volumetric. And it also aesthetically, I think, it shows in a way something that is assembled yet organic. Like it is half kind of, it has a kind of natural feel at the same time, yet it's also assembled. So that for me was kind of as a proposition really interesting. I absolutely had no clue how to build this. Like this was also like a pure naive exercise. Ultimately, we had to add a layer of carbon fiber, of glass fiber on the model to make it hold up, because we were constructing a horizontal brick wall, which is like an embarrassing stupidity as an architect to try to do, obviously. Like how can you stack, bricks horizontally? That just doesn't work. So we had to add this layer of glass fiber, which obviously is continuous, in order to make this stand up. However, like despite of this kind of criticism, I think the office has then tried subsequently in the next few years to make this happen, like to build this, right, and to build in a way on this kind of proposition of that image. Now, one of the kind of benefits then of that discrete project is then after, of course, this villa did not get built, and ultimately the client decided to build another project. But then we could also kind of play around in the next series of projects with the same parts. So this is a museum at the Karlsplatz in Vienna, which we did as a kind of a provocation for the competition, not seriously with the premise of wanting to win this competition, but more as a kind of exercise to explore how the design principles could scale up. And this plays a little bit the same game as that we have a familiar form of the slabs, which is a provocation also, that it's not, there's no interest in kind of curvilinear, topologically complex space. This is a very boring building. This is a building that in a way consists of 3 horizontal strata, but all of the kind of qualities are derived in a way from the interaction of these parts. And then ultimately, of course, we didn't do that competition, so then you could do a table as well with the same element. And then in the next project, which I think is probably the one kind of the next project that keeps the practice going intellectually and creatively, was also done in 2015. And that was a proposition for a multi-family home in Belgium. So basically 3 apartments stacked on top of each other. And the idea here was to really do a proper discrete building. So we would not use any additional, materials such as like glass fiber or tension. We would actually begin to think how this would structurally work. We would not use any customization. We would really just build the entire building out of an L-shaped part and a straight bar on 3 different scales. So this is the project that came out of it. And again, the argument here, there's a kind of an argument, and I think also Evan hinted a bit that it's a very different argument from the kind of continuous project, in this sense that this looks excessive, but it is not excessive. It's highly, highly economic and rational. It's a purely modular project that only consists of repeating parts. They're not actually materially excessive. These parts are hollow on the inside. They actually consist of thin timber sheets. So it's not that there's an enormous amount of timber in the project. It's actually, relatively lightweight. And it's a project, again, that is ultimately really boring. So it's deliberately articulating itself almost as a kind of a domino, a stack of 3 horizontal strata that are then kind of somehow materialized with this kind of cold and relentless repetition of the smaller elements. The small elements remain always autonomous. So when we look at this, we register this kind of figural aspect of these parts, like we're looking at the kind of the L-shaped patterns that they create. It suggests almost a building that is, you could call it like an incomplete whole, but I don't like that term so much. I would say it's like in part whole, like it's never fully complete. It's not, we could easily add or remove another part. We could maybe imagine that it could expand a little bit further. It's very fuzzy in its kind of definition. It has no facade, like it's very sectional almost. It's almost like we've sliced it. Yeah, like I think it has a kind of a very, very strange quality to it that we know on the one hand, when you look at it long enough, you understand the rationality, yet of course it's kind of beyond normal expectations. And these are some of the interiors of the project. And I think that also reveals a few other interesting aspects. Like I would actually argue that this space is phenomenologically continuous. So while it consists of discrete elements, it is actually a continuum. although it's not curved, but it's a continuum in the sense that it's a repeated operation of the same part. You have the same part in all directions where you look. It's in the floor, which is not actually a floor. It's just, an aggregation of parts. It's above your head. I do have to always do this Freudian lapse. Like in my project, there are no columns, there are no beams, and no ceilings. But we don't have words for it, so I have to say like it's in the ceiling. However, there is no such thing as a ceiling. It's just a series of parts. And what it also does, it shows basically, I think in terms of like inhabitation and domesticity, it wants to kind of give a little bit the impression almost as if you would be in a forest or in a cave and you go camping and you domesticate the space. So there is nothing in this space that caters to human inhabitation per se. It's absolutely dysfunctional. This is not a functional space. The elements have no function. A floor has a certain function, a column has a certain function, a wall has a certain function, but these elements have no function. It's only after their kind of aggregation that you could say that they maybe establish functions as an emerging property, but in themselves they have no function. So deliberately, the light that you see here, I absolutely hate lights that are, inset in ceilings. Like I cannot stand it, which by the way, I think Le Corbusier also hates. So the light here is only indirect. So you would literally have to go buy this light bulb in IKEA. This is the kind of IKEA 10 euros, $15 light bulb that you buy and you plug it in and the cable lays on the floor. The same with the radio on the left. The kind of piles of books. Like it's really like you kind of need to come to this space and then begin to inhabit it. And again, like all of the elements perform in a way like without function. Right? You can see also in the plan the kind of loose plan. So there's just a kitchen volume here that contains the bathroom, the kitchen, toilet, and then the rest of the space you could kind of organize it however you want. Right? There is no kind of functional premise from the top down in how you need to inhabit this space. This is the plan, like how it sits between kind of walls of the garden, and it becomes this kind of very blurry black object that is between a reflected ceiling plan and a figure, and it kind of like disappears in the garden. And then I'm not actually going to explain exactly how we build it, but I just want to show you at this point in the lecture that this is not sci-fi, so that you can actually build this. This is at the Royal Academy. This was an installation we built last year, which was a section of the Diamond House. Very selfish move. I really wanted to experience the Diamond House. And it will never get built, as the renderings that I showed you. But this was a kind of a chance to occupy, to build a one-to-one and to just be able to at least sit in the renderings that I just showed you. And you see here this kind of assembly of these elements. Also the way that, in this case, it does cater a bit more to human inhabitation, which was forced upon us by the curators. So you can actually kind of lay on some of these parts that kind of act as benches. And again, what you see is a kind of a pure repetition, right, of this straight and L-shaped element that kind of constructs everything around us. And you can read it in a way as, it's doing this kind of primitive move that it wants to construct a horizontal plane and a kind of column-like element, yet there is never, even structurally speaking, there is no such thing as a column. This is this kind of beautiful images of the ceiling where you can kind of see that pixelate, can imagine how that kind of continues. And then some chunks that we distributed throughout the museum. And at this stage, I want to talk a little bit more, pick your brain, maybe also then for the questions about what makes these things work. So essentially, the most logical architecture for discreteness would be the pile, what you see on the left. That would be a mere kind of, series of autonomous elements that you just pile. Zero, as Evan referred to it, actuated matter, I think you called it, like zero material organization, zero computation. Physical computation, yes, but kind of zero decision making on the positioning of those elements. And why is that natural? It's because, you know, the parts would never be in structurally compromising positions. They would just kind of be naturally aggregated by gravity in a way. So the pile is kind of probably a natural thing to do with discreteness. However, I don't do piles. You know, the material is really organized and curated to the detail. I make decisions about every single one of the parts, right? We are evaluating and controlling their positions. So somehow the aesthetics and the kind of appeal of these projects, I think, partially emerges from the fact that there is a certain familiarity that you recognize, the kind of the slab, for example, and then the confrontation of something that we know with something that we don't know, the kind of unfamiliar operation then of these discrete elements. So I think there's a tension there that that makes it more interesting than the pile. And that also makes it more interesting than this. Like, I mean, this would be like almost, you could say, a dome. Like, that's also a natural operation for a discrete project in a way. But I would argue that it's not discrete because in this case, you know, it's structurally natural to do this. But in this case, you would rely on an overall super form to organize these elements. So this one is a very kind of illogical and weird thing to do, right? Because you are confronting kind of, you have to resolve certain kind of difficult structural questions when you want to do this operation. So, I mean, also recently, just as kind of an exploration, I have not shown this to anyone. You are the first ones to see this. This is a project that I called the Rockhut. So after I did the block hut, this is the Rockhut. So the Rockhut is trying to do a project that works more on homogeneous distribution of forces. So this is, structurally speaking, and if you talk with engineers, a more logical discrete project. You accumulate a lot of mass, and therefore in all of these parts, they never kind of put into this kind of difficult moments where, you know, one part needs to carry a lot of load or needs to cantilever. Like, this is kind of more amorphous, rocky project. And I'm extremely excited by this, by the way. Like, that's why I'm showing it, although it's just a Rhino screenshot. But I'm extremely excited by this because I think, I mean, first of all, this one consists of two parts, right? It's an arrow-shaped element and a little tetrahedral element. Like, really, 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 I mean, extremely modular. Like, there's not even like different scales, right? Very, very blunt. And I think it does something really strange that, again, it has the same quality as the original Blockhead project, as in that it is half natural, half assembled. It looks a bit like a rock, yet it also looks strangely like a Firenzean Renaissance, you know, experiment with a kind of rustication. So it's between kind of human artificial computed, etc., etc. So I'm very interested to kind of like this is sitting on my desk for the next opportunity to deploy this thing. But of course, I mean, my work until this has always kind of deployed itself in relation to the slab, right? Always in relation to this kind of horizontal strata. Like, this is the competition Evan mentioned in the beginning. This is the Budapest National Gallery, which was the first big international competition where I got a bit closer to winning it together with SoA-RPI. Ultimately, was cancelled and relaunched, probably because they found out I was 27 at the time and a one-man band. So the competition was cancelled and then reopened, where you could only participate if you had won a Pritzker Prize or a RIBA gold medal or something, and then Sana and Snøhetta ran away with it. But like, this one is also kind of, I think, this is a much older project before kind of this radical discreteness came in. But I think it has this kind of same aesthetic ideas as we were talking about before. Like, it is a continuous repetition of the same operation, although not as kind of, I mean, obsessively discrete as the recent work, but it is a kind of a familiar form that is dissolved with thousands and thousands of non-functional elements that are then, I mean, in this case, very gestural, almost kind of, I like to kind of compare it with this kind of minimalist expression is painting, where it's kind of a continuous operation, almost like a brush stroke, you could say, that is kind of put on, instead of the canvas, the slab acts as the canvas, right? So there's this kind of minimal operation. And of course, I mean, Evan hinted a bit at that in also in the introduction. This work is kind of the dialectic, or seems the dialectic opposite of the previous digital work, which was based on exactly the premise that there would be no more parts and that there would be no more assembly. And that was Greg Lynn's premise, of course, in animate form, that architecture could exist without part-to-whole relationships, that it could be one object, one whole, that will continuously fold and expand to give to create space and structure. And it was pitched, that digital project, I believe, was pitched as in itself as the dialectical opposite to modernism. So it was pitched as a project against seriality, against universality, and against kind of objectivity in this sense. So it was pitched against, you know, this is the image that Greg Lynn used of the Ford factory as a kind of a key example of this modernist seriality. And of course, if you compare then Greg Lynn, his curve, and I think this is a very interesting exercise. So Greg Lynn drew the kind of the modernist curve as a discrete curve that consists of parts. These parts are universal, so it's a circle as a geometry, and then it's assembled into a curve. And then Greg Lynn, his curve, this kind of premise of the early digital, is a curve that has no parts, that is continuously differentiated, and that can never kind of be mathematically described, and it can never be described down to a bit. So then this is kind of my provocation then for that work, is that then the discrete is establishing a kind of another option in a way for architecture to develop that is different from both modernism and the early digital. But it's a complex, I would argue, I would like to argue, and that's something maybe we can debate, and I would like to argue that it's not dialectical to the early digital, and it's not dialectical to modernism. So although it seems antithetical, it seems like it's the exact opposite of the continuous early digital project. Early digital, you know, has no parts, the discrete has parts. The early digital is all like mass customized, and the discrete is never, is not mass customized in its parts. However, it is not dialectically related in this sense that, you know, it is not a modernist project. Like a modernist project would believe in objectivity and universality, whereas the discrete project actually takes on board the idea of subjectivity as we find it in the continuous project. So you would not say that there is a universal part that, you know, works for the entire world. There would not be a fixed typology that we all need to live in, that is, you know, the equivalent of the Maison Domino. There would not be a kind of a fixed cell, but you could actually customize the discrete in every instance. You would not customize, you know, its component parts, but you would customize in a way by being able to assemble the parts together differently in every instance, because we have disconnected form from function. So in that sense, I would say that it's not dialectically related to their kind of historical precedents, but that it takes on board aspects from both. So in this sense, I think the discrete is actually a continuation of continuity, that it takes on board some of the premises there. And I think also, if you look in a way, I mean, things are never purely black and white, of course. And I think if you compare, you know, these two images, which I think if the Ford factory was the image that defines modernism, then maybe this image of the Amazon warehouse is the image that defines our times. Also with all the social practices that are associated with, you know, both cases, the gig worker on the right and the kind of, you know, blue collar worker that could afford their own car and would rise into the middle class on the left. And you see that those images, at least, you know, they're very different modes of production, but they're not completely dialectically opposed to each other. So if we then look at this curve, we can kind of reveal, like kind of play around with it and reveal some interesting properties. Like one is that the discrete is scale agnostic. You could do a discrete project on this resolution. if you have budget and machines that can enable this project, but you could also do it at a lower resolution without kind of throwing, your ideology overboard. It's scale agnostic, which is something super strange, by the way. Again, something we need to discuss. It's also non-geometrical in the sense that there is no, this curve that you see here is not defined by a surface or by a strict geometry. To make it three-dimensional, you just add one array. So instead of a double array, you do a triple array. Yeah, and then again, like it's scale agnostic, right? So you could kind of begin to question, like if you look at this image, if you lower that resolution, we almost end up in a kind of a medium plan almost, right? And like this project, then that's also again one that I have never shown, brought to you exclusively tonight. Again, just a Rhino screenshot of a recent kind of project, which is very, very blunt. It's just aggregation of box-like elements, which would almost fit maybe at this moment in this kind of resolution, right? Like they're huge elements. Like, I mean, you can kind of imagine a little bit yourself. There's no scale in this, but you can imagine the scale. Maybe you do it subconsciously. Keep in mind you need to be able to walk under that beam on the top there, so maybe bigger than you think. But for me, this is like a very interesting kind of moment that it's like an extreme kind of reduction of the amount of parts. So I want to talk now quickly a little bit about strange consequences of having embarked on this discrete journey. For example, I mean, I cannot look at architecture anymore with halls. I don't see halls anymore. I only see parts. So this image is Maison Domino before it was restored, but I can only look at it in this way. Like I look with X-ray eyes, where I don't see the form, but I can only see the way that it's constructed out of parts, which is a very strange visibility that I obtained as an architect after having worked on the discrete. So I look at Maison Domino like this, and I look also at all my peers to projects like this. They can do whatever funky form. I look at the parts. Very, very frustrating. And it also reveals an interesting question about architecture, like how difficult is architecture? This wall is, if you want to draw this wall, it takes, in Rhino, it would take you, to draw the form of the wall, it would take you 3 seconds, right? It's just 3 points, slightly twisted, curvy, not entirely curved, but slightly oblique wall. This is the wall of Osaka Castle. So none of the qualities, I think we all agree this is an extremely beautiful wall, but none of its qualities come from its form, right? The qualities come completely only from its kind of parts in the way that it's constructed. And at the same time, obviously, we don't want to fall back on craft. We don't want to make an argument like some of the Swiss colleagues and the kind of Zumthors and phenomenologists in this world will do, that everything is about the detail and that it's only about craft. So we will just do kind of, beautifully crafted boxes, right? It's not to say that this wall is beautiful because it's beautifully crafted. We can also maybe think about it that this wall is beautiful because it has this strange tension between a very deliberate material organization where the parts remain autonomous and yet it kind of constructs that kind of recognizable familiar wall. Another thing that I had to drop and that I absolutely cannot do anymore as an architect is talk about space in a kind of modernist sense, like, or also, I mean, postmodernist. I mean, maybe what we learn in school, I don't really know how to explain that, but like this house, for example, which is an absolutely brilliant house, the U House by Toyo Ito, fantastic house, which is completely based. You can only explain this project by talking about space, like there's an inside courtyard, there's a corridor that wraps around the courtyard, and you need to describe this in like poetics of kind of space, right? And it's brilliant, but you cannot do this with a discrete project because we don't have overall super form. It's impossible. Very sad, but I have to drop this. This, however, Su Fujimoto's house H, I think this one is. This one we can do, right? So this is a house that has a strange relationship to scale. I believe it's relatively similar. And sorry, I'm just going to flip back to second. We're approaching this like so. We cannot do Toyo Ito, but we can engage with something like this if you want to. We can also look at this other. I'm just showing you my kind of favorite houses now. We can do this as well. This is Casa Mora by Emilio Tugnon. The interesting thing with the Discrete is that in a way it's scale agnostic, but in a way it's also agnostic to architectural position. You could decide to arrange your discrete parts in an uptight, rigid grid if you wanted to, right? That's a strange thing. You could arrange them like I do, which is kind of whatever, the way that I do it, but you could also be a kind of, you could also do it in this way, right? Technically speaking. So, or, you could access also typologies like this one, which is, I just slipped my mind, Casa Mora. Yeah, the previous one was Casa de Piedra. This one is Casa Mora by Iñaki Abalos, which is a functionless building. Very interesting as a precedent. There are no fixed functions. This can kind of be inhabited. One day you can decide the living room is in the middle. The next day you can make it your bedroom, which are properties that discreteness can work with quite well. And again, the kind of Toyo Ito, Le Corbusier world can. Or this house by Christian Carretz, which is also a pretty functionless monolithic space. Again, another thing that we need to drop is context, which I don't really care. I mean, I'm not so sad about, but like this is Herzog Demerol, beautiful museum in France, which is completely contextual in its kind of arguments of like how it's built and constructed. And this, of course, like if you work with discreteness, your parts exist before the context is there. So obviously, in a discrete world, we have to create another relationship to context. And maybe we can debate that in the discussion, but my argument would be that, there are many ways. I would kind of argue that most architects actually secretly don't care about context. And that even Herzog Demerol's approach would be an idea that precedes context. So the kind of discrete architect in a way becomes like a serial architect, like a serial killer, you would be a serial architect, where you kind of iterate through work. Another kind of question maybe to this kind of a funny question related to scale is like, how low can you go? How far can we push this idea of scale being scale agnostic, right? So if we keep reducing Greg Lynn's curve, ultimately we end up with nothing, right? With a straight line, a digital discrete straight wall or straight line, or this box, which would be a digital box if we reduce the resolution far enough. And that's kind of an obsession that I have recently developed, which is an obsession with scale. I actually we're all, I think, fascinated by societies in the past who managed to like build Stonehenge or the pyramids, and this kind of incredible feat of this, these are humans here sitting on this massive building block. So I became extremely interested in working on this kind of massive scale. Like this is a section for a museum in Korea where you see this kind of extremely blunt and almost kind of stupid section where you just have a few of these massive parts that are 15 meters long, locked together to construct the roof. So this brings us to chapter 2, but unfortunately I have spoken for almost 1 hour and I don't want to not bore you, but like I don't want to speak for another hour. So if I get 5 minutes, I will just show the concert hall. And I think by now you also know why the second chapter could be called Irresponsibly Naive. Like that was going to talk a bit about the technological consequences of like, I'll skip this a little bit of like how ultimately then we got this to work structurally and how we devised all of these technologies to make this building blocks operate as functionless parts. This is a bit more like a nerdy structural conversation running through a number of built work and experimental pavilions. Like this one, again, if you remember the block hut, this is the block hut that we actually, in a way, managed to build for the Tallinn Biennale. I would argue this project is very similar to the block hut. And, you know, also a conversation then about how we can deploy this for mass housing. And again, I like to do this comparison, right? Like the kind of initial premise of the office to build the block hut, and then Tallinn that actually is the built version of the block hut. So I'll skip a bit through this. Yeah, so the last project, and I'll wrap up with this one, is a competition for a concert hall in Nuremberg. Germany is an extremely difficult country for competitions and for young architects. So we participated in a way with, you could call it Pandora's box, like it was a box. We submitted in the first round of the competition an exact box because we knew that this would fly with the Germans. We didn't say anything about the way how we were going to construct this box. That was a secret. Otherwise, we would not get selected for that competition. So we just gave them a glass box. We got selected for the next round. We're competing with 10 established offices. This was me together with a friend of mine from Germany, Stefan Albrecht. So we were a two-man band against kind of a whole series of larger practices. And our idea was to really, Nuremberg is in Bavaria, it's a forested region. So the idea was to extract a concert hall from the forest, to make an argument that we could establish this extremely short production chain, that we could go to the forest, we could harvest the trees. These trees then go to, you know, the equivalent of Elon Musk's gigafactory, but this is Metsä Wood, one of the kind of largest timber producers in Europe. Then in a fully automated workflow, the forest gets sliced into sheets of timber. It gets glued back into an engineerable product that we can buy, that we can put a price on, that we can calculate and engineer with. We take those sheets, we, again, nothing of this is sci-fi, we run it through this massive CNC machine, and ultimately we establish this kit of parts. So these are all the elements that the concert hall consists of. None of these elements have exact functions. They're all derived from the same V-section, and they're all cut from the same thickness of timber, which is a 15 centimeter cross-laminated timber sheet. These are all the finishes that we need for the building. So this is not in timber. These are precast facade elements. And that's the scale. Like it's huge, basically. These are the people. This is how it works, how we designed it. So these are, what you see in gray is the digital model. So this is a voxel with a V-shaped element in there. These elements get aggregated and begin to produce architectural features that are then translated into CLT sheets. This would be the workflow. You would cut all of the sheets, you would pre-assemble them into V-sections, ship them in a truck, and bring them to site. This is the entire concert hall laid out flat on the ground. All the parts you need to build your concert hall. That's again the process from digital, like this extreme discreteness, actually, like a very boring voxel space with all of these little fragments that can then be rationalized into a lot of timber sheets that are again repeating. And then that's the concert hall itself, looking at the entry. And so what you see here is like, it's again, like kind of interesting argument to discuss. So this is not a box. This building is not a glass box. There is, you know, there's no such thing geometrically as a box. It's a voxel space that, you know, at some point stops and is limited. But again, ontologically speaking, there is no box. There are also no floor plates and columns in this building. There's actually nothing in this building that you would know from any other building that is built. It only consists of the same repeating V-section timber elements, and it's exactly the same element that appears in the vertical plane as in the horizontal plane. There is no floor, so you walk from this triangular element, and you take a step, and you land on the next triangular element. You walk over an edge between the two elements. There's no floor. There's no floor slab. It's just a building that only consists of autonomous parts. It's a completely organic building, I would argue. Like it's a timber monolith, a primitive timber monolith, where the same material operation happens all around you, just as the diamond's house that we looked at earlier. So this part that you see here is the same part that you see there. Of course, the staircase is a kind of a notable exception that has absolutely nothing to do with the discrete logic, but it's a beautiful staircase. I outsourced it to my dear friend Isaïe Bloch, who also teaches at the Bartlett. I just told him to design the staircase, and we'll puncture it there through to the roof. You have these like super joints that are expressed here in white. And then as a building, it's also like, I mean, it's super, super simple to construct. It's almost no detailing. It's like detailing for kindergarten. It's just kind of 99% of the building is just this timber parts that, you know, that we have kind of come up with. Then it just gets wrapped here with a layer of insulation. You add the facade panel on top of it. And that's kind of the argument that ultimately there's this weird thing that architecture, rather than entering a kind of a hyperbolic future of glossy surfaces that, you know, maybe remind us of like the car industry or spaceships, that architecture through automation and this way of thinking actually returns to its kind of super primitive core. Like it's directly from the forest to the building. It's a kind of automated primitive hut in a way. And if you remember this diagram, that really old and really new are in a way very close related to each other, which is also the qualities that I think we can extract from the block hut. Or we could speculate about this, right? That in both cases, I like to also make this comparison, that you really old and really new are in a way closely related. And then this gets further explored in other projects. Like this is another argument, which I think by now you can make yourself, right? It's a roof that is not a roof. This is not a pitched roof. This is just an assembly of parts. This is actually the same project as the concert hall, it's just rotated 45 degrees. So if you tilt your head 45 degrees, you have the foyer of the concert hall. It's the same project. There was a museum in Helsinki. And this is, I'm just flipping through this in 1 minute. This is then, you know, the work that we do at the Bartlett, where we have the opportunity to look at this work in 1 year long research projects, where we actually program the robots to assemble all of these building blocks in a fully automated way, where we devise this kind of little robots that can crawl over structures, that can assemble these parts. Sometimes the blocks themselves become robots. So we have parts that are actually robots that can assemble other parts. We do these experiments where we throw together with robots these kind of massive chunks. And again, you know, experimenting then on housing, because that's ultimately where we think that this technology is very much needed today, is in like disrupting kind of the way the global housing crisis and the way that we are kind of stuck in inhabiting difficult spaces. So if you want to learn more about this, there's also, like, I will skip the politics chapter. That's usually the chapter I start with. So this is the very first time ever in a lecture that I skipped the politics chapter. You can watch maybe some of my older lectures to learn more about, you know, how this work wants to also investigate basically arguments about ownership, about robots, about automation, the impact of automation on society, and how we hope ultimately to instrumentalize his work to set up kind of, to in a way disrupt fundamentally the way that we construct housing. We want to create our own housing platforms where we would be able to create higher quality housing in shorter times, bypassing the entire construction industry. Because ultimately, and that's maybe my kind of schizophrenia as an architect, or my kind of internal conflict, is that you know, the first part of the lecture I show you is all about architecture. But ultimately, the premises of the work is that, you know, we have a short production chain where we can produce extremely efficiently, extremely economically. We are able to create environments that are escape the kind of rational, non-inspiring, boring architecture that we associate with modularity. We can push modularity, the efficiencies of modularity, in a much more kind of inspiring world. So ultimately, what you need to do with this stuff is not funky concert halls and funky museums, but we should do work for the 99% of housing with this. That is kind of what we want to do. The museums help, I think, to generate, their experimental projects that help to generate ideas. But we need to use this for the many, not for the kind of exclusive project. So on that note, I will end this, and you can reach out and follow the work on my Instagram, little pitch. Of course, you need to buy the 2 books that I mentioned on the Discrete and on robotic building. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gilles. If we were in MPAC right now, there'd be a loud standing round of applause. Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. So I have a series of maybe observations and questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I wrote down some notes here. The first one, the title I have is Dust Storms, Massive Striated Clumps, and Tamed Minimalism. So it's interesting because I've seen a number of your lectures. If we were to go in chronological order, and I'm oversimplifying this, actually starting from your thesis at the AA, which I refer to as the dust storm, because these are kind of they're comprised of kind of shredded spaghetti and all directions found in the proto house.
Yeah.
And then it moves forward in time to the massive striated timber clumps suspended like a kind of delaminated geology in the Guggenheim Helsinki project. And then it more recently, the Nuremberg Concert Hall is the latest in the evolution of the work, where it's now the dominant reading is one of an economy of means, with the loss of, in quotes, these atmospheres, or an explicit desire. Well, I think it's still an explicit desire for ambiguity. Now, this is not a qualitative statement, because on many levels, the work has become incrementally more sophisticated intellectually, and certainly your a kind of genuine interest to want to move it into the built environment as a realizable project. So it may have started entirely theoretical and to some extent gestural in the early years. As it develops and grows, grows in scale in terms of a higher degree of the interrogation of the performance of those parts, it's inevitable that there's consequences in the outcomes of the work. So when I spoke about a kind of tamed minimalism, I was saying that one of the things that has been shed, again, observation, is this more kind of exuberant atmospheric quality, which is closer to some of your earlier comments when you spoke about cave-like.
Mm.
And I must say that in the middle zone, and I'm talking about these massive striated timber clumps, there's a beautiful ambiguity, not only between part to whole, but also in terms of a reading as to whether it's an assembly, it's a process of making, or it's a process of unmaking, a carving, which I would think you would see that as a compliment, given the precedents, the kind of historic primitive precedents that you refer to. So the last project, and I'm referring to the Nuremberg Concert Hall, which is beautifully clever too, and it's almost like you had to. There were so many forces specific to the competition, as in the limit of the box, similar to the Panton chair. All of a sudden, the notion of incompleteness was unavailable. Yeah, I mean, you could imply it, but the fact is the box was so heavy as a boundary condition, and I'm sure that the economics of the project kind of forced a certain restraint that you had to build into the rule set. So I think it's a fantastic project, but in the context of your entire work, it feels another way of saying it is kind of pure syntax. It's like and that's when I referred to minimalism. It was almost as though like this extraordinary Solowit game where you were given so many moves on the board to complete the building and no more, and you devised that for yourself. So I suppose the question is maybe I know the answer, maybe I don't. Is this simply a product of the pragmatic realism that one faces having to deal with buildings, juries, budgets, et cetera? Or do you think the research has evolved where the project of the discrete can and should operate in a more minimalist arena?
That's a question I ask myself a lot, Evan. Like, I don't have I actually don't have a clear answer to that. So it's something that I'm probably, you could say it's one of the driving forces behind the work, to do that inquiry, right? To question this. And it's so the two projects I think that define the practice that have set out the research agenda are the Rockhut and the Diamond House, which are the ones that are maybe we can consider massive striated timber clumps, as you call them, roughly. And in a way, like it was a pragmatic operation when I started trying to aggressively get the build work to make the aesthetics more like to tune it back a bit. That was a pragmatic decision, absolutely. Like I wanted to, you know, I know that if I would enter a competition showing something like the Diamond House, that you would not have a chance. No one would even look at it. And until that you would actually realize a first prototype and people take it serious. But at this stage, it would be very, very difficult. So it was a pragmatic decision, but then I started to become really interested in the consequences of that decision. Because ultimately, and that's why I'm talking, for example, also about scale agnostic, the fact that the scale actually ideologically for the project doesn't matter. You can do a project with thousands of small parts or a few really large parts. I don't fundamentally change my position. Of course, something that changes, I mean, I do think like the Nuremberg Concert Hall is extremely tightly kind of, it has a lot of constraints, as I think the Sol Lewis reference is on point there. But I mean, I would say that I've compared a lot the Diamond House and the concert hall. Like I've done that exercise like many times, thinking back and forth of like, you know, what do I actually like better, independent of the kind of the circumstances of having to win a competition or not. And I feel weirdly attracted to the kind of very reduced simplicity of the concert hall. Because somehow, sometimes I think that something like the Diamond House is just a little bit too much. That I mean, it's exciting, but I also think that it lacks a bit of control. And I'm interested in, I mean, I would say like I probably have deep at heart kind of a tendency to want to understand this issue of minimal means. Like I'm interested in things like dogma, right? This kind of productive dogmas, things, constraints that you take. And I am interested in the minimalist argument that if you can do it with like, you know, less moves, why not do it with less moves, right? Like there is a certain interest there. But it's at the same time, it's deeply contradictory because, I mean, you know, I'm from Belgium. Belgians are not radical. We are anarchists. We are always like, you know, into controversies, and we're not Germans, we're not Swiss. Like Swiss would be very good at this, but you know, the work always has like internal contradictions and wants to be something that's not another thing. So at the same time, I mean, the more like the work is definitely still going down in like, for the moment, you know, some of the work I showed you today that is not published yet is working on like extreme reduction, right? Like just boxes, raw stacks of boxes. And while I'm doing that, I'm already kind of longing a little bit to to move back to direction like Rockhut and to again like increase resolution in some of that work. And maybe it's a tension that will keep being there throughout my career. I think I don't think
Yeah,
we
yeah,
need to
yeah.
exclude them.
To me, it's not a problem, and I must say that the representational system that you devise for yourself to highlight certain theoretical claims and to deliver maybe complex ideas in a very elemental and accessible manner to your audience, I think holds the clue here. So I certainly don't see these as diametrically opposed. On the contrary, you showed later, maybe 2/3 into the presentation, and first you were juxtaposing, I suppose, analog to digital, the renaissance of the parametric, and there was a single cosine line, and you tried to you load that line throughout the presentation with a series of conceptual imperatives. And one of the later diagrams, you argue and you do it very quickly, because I know that in a presentation to SoA-RPI, the question came up, can the discrete actually deal with curvature? And so the diagram that you showed tonight says it can, that if the offsets and the length of the vector line are the proper dimensional relationship, you can actually create the illusion of a curve.
Yep.
Well, so I'd take that diagram and reassess it conceptually in relation to the conversation we're having right now, which is to say two things. One is, although it is seemingly a bottom-up project, that it comes out of the part, and for a certain history of your authorship, you've had to work autonomously. As the project moves closer to the larger kind of cultural domain, there are forces that enter into that diagram that assert those forces onto the decision making and the outcome. And it seems to me, it seems to me one of the reasons it's moved into the more minimalist direction is because the extraordinary pressure to figure out how to deliver this radical project would mean that you would have to devise some kind of wizardry with respect to the economics associated with it. And it was beautiful when you said you go to the forest, you mine the forest, you turn it into the lumber, into flat stock. The flat stock moves into the tetrahedron. The tetrahedron elements are also ordered by I'll call them the universal joint for you. Those are the joints that allow you to deal with the XY axis. So to me, that suggests that as the budget changes, or even I could argue the sentiment of the jury changes, that the rules in the game may recalibrate. And because you're so skillful with devising a kit of parts and a game that although you control it, you could also argue, and you did in your presentation, it's open source. You could give the game away to other authors to play it. In fact, you're arguing that there are Japanese and Swiss and German architects out there right now playing, and they don't even know it, right? The one thing, kind of final comment on that, I suppose I beg to differ. You mentioned something where at one point you said you're not, I forget which project, maybe it was Herzog de Meuron, you're not interested in context. It seemed, that's a Patrick Schumacher position too. I find it so odd, given the enormous amount of control in the system to be able to operate simultaneously within the syntax and the program and the physics of the building internal, it's also capable of expanding endlessly, as you said, to be able to acquire certain information from context and actually accommodate for that. In other words,
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like the context one is a provocation. Like I put it there because in every lecture someone asks this, and they're always like, okay, like you obviously it's so obvious in your case that the project pre-exists a brief, right? I mean, I often even like reuse the same parts in different projects. Like the Helsinki Museum is done with exactly the same parts we engineered for Nuremberg, also because it's just easy. We've done that. We use the same engineers, and you just like you don't need to create a whole team again. It's just like we've done this work. We didn't win that competition, so now we just move it into the next project. And then people are obviously saying like, okay, like it's very obvious in your case that your work precedes the context and you don't care about context. And in itself, that is not a problem. I mean, I think there are, you know, different kinds of architects. There are some that argue through context, and there are some that don't. I generally find the second category more interesting than the first one. I like people with ideas that, you know, that exist without necessarily a question. But the thing is, I agree with your statement. Like, my kind of move is to say I don't care about context. However, I think the work can do context like incredibly well, and I agree with what you were saying now. Like, obviously, there is a deliberate thinking about context. There is a box in Germany next to a modernist, you know, concert hall. Obviously, it's deliberately a box. There is the pitched roof in Finland because it's a primitive kind of typology that we find in Helsinki with these boat houses. Of course, the pitched roof was used, you know, first there in Helsinki. And I think the conversation that I mentioned, which is about the confrontation of the operation of the parts and their ability to kind of resample or diffuse a familiar, enables you this possibility of working in different settings and contexts, right? There is also, I think, something really interesting, and that's more like a historical debate or something we could talk about longer, is the question, if you look at part-to-whole relationships, it's actually interesting that they also appear in different parts of the world, right? In the same way. Like if you look at timber construction in Europe and in Japan, you will find kind of log cabins in both countries. You will find similar details. You will find similar solutions. There are pyramids in Egypt, but there's also pyramids in every other, you know, continent, right? So that is also interesting, I think, like this kind of possibility to address context not through maybe a symbolic figure or super form, but also through kind of part-to-part relationships. But that's something, I mean, that's, yeah, that's something maybe that needs to be kind of further questioned and explored, like what the consequences are of that.
Yeah, I mean, and the reason why I raised it was precisely because, and although you've stated it more assertively in other lectures, that you're not interested in elevation and you're not interested necessarily what the building looks like from the outside as a as a discrete form. And on some level, and again, it's more evident in the earlier projects, it's almost like the process is arrested in some of the houses where, as you mentioned, you could continue to build it. The cantilever could extend further. You can thicken the volume of space between the roof and the floor, however you want to, that maybe that's not the right terminology, you don't like that, but what I mean to say is that unlike certain projects where that's it's exactly what it was intended to be, yours is somehow a kind of Duchampian stoppage. It's arrested in time and space. And so it has the capacity, if we're going to talk about scale, it isn't just the scale of the members, although they're growing exponentially in the more recent projects, the sizing of the profiles. But in terms of their breadth as a kind of a mega sprawl, your project could move into an urbanistic realm. And insofar as it could take on that ambition, it would make context on the most profound level, right?
Yeah.
So it's
yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean I mean, I'm super interested and I'm behind on that agenda. Like, I have an agenda for larger, like, since a number of years actually, that I'm working on to ask this kind of fundamental question of how would it look like to operate, like deploy this on an urban scale. And
right.
I think that really holds like something very, very interesting to think about, because like all of this work, especially the kind of housing work, wants to be multiple, right? That's also the argument in that there is no facade and there's no super form, and you can easily kind of repeat and roll it out, yet it's never kind of a boring form of repetition, right? So it would be a kind of a subtle shift. So, I mean, I've been doing some experiments, I mean, mainly in teaching context and kind of unpublished work where I'm working on trying to question what, you know, a city of parts would look like.
Yeah.
Like, what are the kind of consequences of that you bypass, you know, this hierarchical cliche, and I forget, you need to correct me now if it's Alberti or Aldo van Eyck or Kahn even who said it, I don't know, that like, you know, a house consists of rooms, and then a city consists of houses, etc., etc. Who was that? Was that Alberti? I don't know. So, you know, like that's usually what kind of like there is this rupture, right? Like if you design a city, you compose it of houses,
Yeah.
of figures. So the question is like, can you bypass that, right? Can you skip the form of the house as the thing that composes a city? Could we actually, you know, compose a city, or you bypass the city? I don't know which one of the two it is, but could you compose it just out of parts? That's I think an extremely interesting.
And by the way, given your thesis, you could either simultaneously test the rules of the city in terms of a kind of theoretical iteration, but you could also develop the building codes, because one of the interesting aspects of your work is you, especially in some of the later slides where you talked about housing, it back to that open source comment, it seems to me that authorship can drift in and out of the discrete for you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the dominant iconography. It can be recessive, and it represents a system that's handed off to others. But I want to move on to another observation and get your feedback on this one. Again, that you probably didn't talk about this much, maybe in the Helsinki project with the staircase, but introducing deviancy into the system. So given this kind of relentless and obsessive commitment to the bottom-up approach, which has been able to generate enormous amount of variation for you, at some moment, you allow in a subversive device, or you inflect a rule where something is imported in that appears to be entirely arbitrary or contradictory. And you find a certain amount of pleasure. And I imagine the Museum of Korea had it, which I don't think you showed tonight, which is a corridor. It's a kind of a curvilinear corridor. And again, in the Guggenheim Helsinki or the Nuremberg concert, it's that circular staircase. So there's really two questions, Gilles. And I would preface by saying, the shock to the system, it would be like Peter Eisenman placing an orthogonal element in his isometric models of his House 10 project. I mean, it is so explicitly foreign, maybe more in the Museum of Korea. So it's a two-part question. The first one is, I assume part of the reason is conceptual, compositional, aesthetic, and the other part, it's embedding flexibility into the game. In other words, although it offers a beautiful juxtaposition aesthetically and compositionally, the kind of deviant device introduces or provides flexibility that you wouldn't be able to acquire otherwise, to accommodate for a series of pragmatic considerations that need to be addressed. And then the second, and this is more of a challenge to you to speak to the student body, addresses the idea of introducing the anomaly and contradiction in any design process in the context of providing some clarity to our students on how to manage this more rarefied mannerist strategy. What guidance would you offer?
Well, the last question is difficult, but the I think it's I think it's a great value for architecture if it can tolerate contradictions and exceptions, and that may sound very kind of postmodern right now, but I think it's great that the system can tolerate it. The fact that it is somehow open-ended enough to that it doesn't get worse, or it would be demolished by an exception. And I like how you point out Eisenman, and like if you would put in a orthogonal staircase there would be a problem. Or with Zaha, right? In any Zaha building, in that kind of like, imagine the Baku project, and you add like whatever a square staircase. I mean, the project is gone, right? It's destroyed. You can't do that. So in a way, I think it's a quality that the project can tolerate, this foreign element. And you're right to say that they have been there from the start. They've always been there. There are the tiny, like very thin stick columns in the Rockhut project, which I didn't talk about today, but which have nothing to do with the system.
Yeah.
Yet I think they're very important. There are, of course, I mean, I have, and I articulated that more in other lectures, I have this kind of statement that anything that caters to humans in my system is an exception in the system. So everything that is staircases, facades, furniture, lighting, like anything that caters to the human body is an exception and is not included in the system. So like I would never ever design a staircase with discrete elements as part of the system. That would be for me, that's a no-go. But in this sense, it is actually consistent, right? It's a consistent kind of argument that like everything that caters to humans is kind of like, it's almost like everything that was present in the domino, although the domino has a staircase, so that doesn't make sense. So that's one. And then I think another one is a little bit, Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, has this statement that the problem with terrorists is that they don't have humor. Like they can never question themselves. Like they cannot just like, step back a bit and look at the situation and be like, hey, I mean, like it can't be like that kind of serious. And I think that's maybe my kind of, subversive nature, that I like to introduce that kind of, almost humoristic aspect that kind of puts the thing, like for me, it kind of like frames it and makes it more approachable and more accessible. The fact that there is a space for almost error, exception, mistakes, humor, that it makes it a bit less maybe pretentious or hermetic almost. So I like that kind of that kind of freedom that comes from the possibility to add this kind of wacky exceptions in the system. Now, when it comes to students, though, it's a very difficult question, Evan. Like I actually started, like one thing that I tell my students a lot. I actually stole it from Reiser Uemoto in the Atlas of Novel Tectonics. They have a beautiful chapter which is 9 common mistakes to avoid, I think the chapter is called. And one of the mistakes they cite is if you work with like a system, that you need to know when to stop. And that was very important. Like the fact that at some point, like if you work with these modular parts, you could end up doing the bathroom in modular parts. I mean, where do you stop, right? So
Right.
with me, the decision was to draw a very clear line, which is this kind of that idea that anything that is for the human body is an exception to the system. So that's a line that I made, right? I mean, some of my students draw other lines. So some of my students will do staircases out of discrete elements, to my despair, but I allow them the space to do that and to explore the consequences there. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. But like I think kind of considering that, like, yeah, that question when to stop it would probably be the kind of the a very good, I think, a very good message to the question.
Yeah, those are great answers, and it's almost as though you've constructed a mirror that is appropriated within the center of the game, and there are these kind of pivot points where you're able to go from the center to the periphery. And there's a longer discussion. There's a common ethic in architectural production practices, the Canon of Architecture, where one constructs a rule set, and as you said, you have to abide by it, and it represents a kind of transgression to do something that's inconsistency, and it might even be misinterpreted as a compromise. And yet, I love the idea that you can contaminate the game with a kind of outsider that actually feels like it works. You know, it's like it's perverse. It's like, wow, let's see more of that. And I imagine where this will become increasingly more, and this is just my take, evident, is you've created your own building components. In other words, you've moved out of architecture into a domain that we typically don't have access to, and I think it's really important. And this is, I suppose, it's part of the political project that we assume greater control and ownership over the production of our parts and systems, and so that we can actually move into an entrepreneurial domain of authorship, because typically we inherit the building components from the building industry as ready-mades. So this is a loaded comment or observation for your work, because when you're producing your installations as curator, you have full control over a spectrum of interests, and you actually author the very material devices that carry loads and distribute loads. I mean, everything is owned by you. The moment you move up to the scale of the building, you have to relinquish that ownership unless you can convince the client to invest in certain research that constitutes a kind of new paradigm shift, right? I mean, like Google or Amazon, right? Someone would come to you and say, okay, you develop the tectonics, and you move from the forest timber to the plywood, whatever, as I said, constructed devices would actually materialize in the building proper. I mean, that's loaded. So, I mean, it kind of beckons the question: would the discursive deviant anomaly participate alongside these inquiries to help you through that phase, right?
Yeah, like, and that's, I mean, that is something that, yeah, that we have to deal with these questions in these projects, right? And I mean, I'm extremely radical there, and I've put myself also in a situation where I can't. It's difficult to compromise there, right?
Yeah.
And I'm using it in a way a bit as a weapon. Like, I like to say that, like, it's true that, I mean, in a way, everything, like when I was describing the Nuremberg concert hall, I was making this kind of statement that I was saying 99% of this building has never, is unfamiliar. You don't know it, you've never seen it, it doesn't exist. It only comes from my kind of world, right? Where it's engineered, designed, produced. They're not building elements, they're not commodities. They don't figure, in Rem Koolhaas, his Elements of Architecture book, which is, the book that in a way documents how incredibly complicated and strange the built environment has become, right? With this kind of continuous catalog of like specs and commodified building objects. None of that, like my work, I would like to say is like, you could also understand it as a critique to Rem, his Elements of Architecture, right? It's a critique to the politics of construction, and it's trying to actively bypass the entire building industry, right? It's trying to say that we do not want to play the game. And the interesting thing is that in a way, like you're in situations where also towards the client and the way that you pitch the project is that it's very much also pitched as that, right? It's pitched as like, this is this extremely novel approach. We can build it extremely efficiently. Everything like, except the window frames, we'll all kind of engineer and control that process. We can cost it exactly. And that's a project. And then the client is also in a position, they can't, in other buildings, you can value engineer them. You can strip away things along the process. In my work, it's impossible. Like, and that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? So it means like you cannot build it in another way. Like you need to build it because it's so raw and rough. There's no cladding in a way. There's no finish. It's just, timber you put in a computer controlled machine and you assemble the timber and that becomes the building, and you add an exterior cladding, which usually, as I'm not interested in exteriors, it's usually not an expensive or crazy material, right? So you either need to, it's so monolithic that you need to throw it out completely or not. And I mean, in a recent project, which I can't show because it's another competition, which, it's very similar to the last Helsinki museum that I showed, the kind of a gabled roof that is not a gabled roof project. And in that one, we needed to, within budget constraints, there was a debate about replacing a part of the floor with a standard floor. Like one of our contractors brought that up, that, it's a design build competition, so the contractor sits on your team and then you need to fight with the contractor, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, we fired the contractor. So we burned through 5 contractors, and then the last contractor was one that was, that just said like, what you're proposing is actually cheaper than replacing it with a standard floor. So he just went like, right, we'll just do it. We'll cut everything, including all the floors. We'll play the game. So yeah, I don't know. Like it's something I would not easily compromise on. I think I would be.
It does beckon the question as to whether it would be in your best interest to establish a partnership with a timber manufacturer independent of the competitions.
Yeah.
In other words, if you had this large economic engine who has a stake in timber construction around the world, and they understood that the novel approach you're taking may represent a kind of next generation of construction elements, that might legitimize the practice in the eyes of some of these clients.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of, also through UCL, which obviously is a big university, we're doing a lot of funded research work into like, there's a lot to kind of flesh out in a way in this discussion. Like one thing obviously that we're trying to do is really develop our kind of catalog of building elements so that they're licensed and they can be licensed out to other contractors to manufacture them.
Right.
Because that would enable us. I'm doing now also a house project in Belgium that is going on site in October next month, actually, which is very scary.
Congratulations.
Which is really the evolution of the part that we started to engineer with Tallinn and that then we used for Royal Academy and then further engineered. And now that thing is like completely ready to get constructed. And that's actually gained a lot of interest from a specific timber company that delivers the timber for this, an Austrian company. So they were extremely excited immediately when they saw that project. So there is something that you can definitely do there. But they are obviously waiting until it's built, right? Once it's built and they get it, they kind of see that it's all working, then I think we can push it further.
No,
Yeah.
I brought that up because it seems to me that one of the opportunities afforded in the education of an architect today is taking on entrepreneurship.
Absolutely, yeah.
And your thesis is perfectly situated for that. I'm gonna move over to one more question and then open it up to the audience. I know we've spoken for quite a while here, and this is their use of the color black. So when it comes to assigning codification to the surfaces of your parts, it appears that you're quite interested in setting up a clear juxtaposition between timber as color and pattern and the color black. The deployment of the black is used, and this is just something that I observed, there may be more examples, to exaggerate the reveals between the parts. You didn't talk about that one today. So those seam lines are exaggerated precisely because you want everyone to understand from an indexical perspective that there's a redundancy, a massive accumulation of parts. Also to reaffirm terminus zones, like a highlight at the limit of a building. That is to say, it goes black when it gets to the periphery. You also do this not only on the elevation, you do it on the roof and the cornice. And then you also assign black to the cross-cut timber elements in your installations. And then more recently, it's dispersed. This is unusual. It's dispersed within the entire tectonic system as found in the 200M housing block. So it seems, although the thesis argues that the system is not interested in elevation, but rather the illusion of continuous growth, you need the black to overcome infinite sameness or homogeneity, which is one of the challenges of a bottom-up approach. Do you agree? And are there other opportunities afforded with the coding for you?
Yeah, that's a good one. One thing with black is that I think I'm interested in this kind of blunt, primordial, primitive, limited things, right? I'm doing architecture with one part. So obviously if I have to use a color, I need to choose black or white, right? I could not probably choose another color. That's purely intuitively. The thing is the color black has played a role in all the work from the very beginning. It's always been there. It's always been there in although it's not in the Rockhut actually, now that I think about it, not in the Rockhut project. The Rockhut project is monolithically just timber. But in all the later work it appears, right? It's there in all the kind of different Helsinki projects. And yeah, I mean, it serves, on the one hand, it serves just to kind of the one where the timber appears on the periphery. It's a way with dealing with facades, actually. It's just a very rational choice of, if you build in timber, you cannot expose it to the environment. So you need to kind of wrap it at some point. So that's been handy in a way that we can kind of use that to transition to the outside. And I had a long debate with Roland Snooks from Kokuja recently about the black painting of the caps. In all the installations, the end of the block in the perpendicular direction is painted black. And we had a long debate about it because a lot of Roland's early work with Kokuja played also on a kind of Boolean operations, right? He would take volumes and he would carve something out of the volume and assign it a different material to kind of gain an illusion of mass. And I think in a way, the work that I do with creating these hollow building blocks is a risky job. It's a risky operation because we're creating a volume that is not a volume. It doesn't have mass. It consists of thin timber sheets.
Right.
So you actually need to kind of like in a way, I applied a lot of architectural tricks to these things. Like the one, you were referring to the seams between the blocks.
Yeah.
They're not actually painted. Like those are actually articulations that we put in the timber sheets that the edges never really meet, so that they create a shadow gap, which is a lot of effort to CNC and like to work around. But then it's super important that its parts remain autonomous, that you read them as a kind of autonomous part, which is over articulated by cutting this extra thick shadow line. And then I think, like for example, we would never reveal in the shadow line, we would never reveal the thickness of the timber because it's very thin. And we want to gain the kind of, if you would ever read a sheet of plywood in this work, it would be destroyed, right? So you're really walking on this kind of thin line. And I think in a way what I did is with the black, it's adding a Boolean operation to this block. And it's kind of showing that it's giving the illusion that if you cut through this block, it would be black. Like
Right.
it's filled with black. And
Right.
the black also, it removes the timber texture, right? It's just black. So it plays this strange game that it feels like the building is built of black, like not even a material, just a kind of abstract color. So I think that's kind of the game that it does. And it works, like I think it works, like we tried that first with the diamond house, and I think that worked extremely well to then register this kind of like, it's almost like the guts of the building, like you feel that it's built of this black matter that then construct these figures, etc. But in the later work, like that was why Roland brought it up, because in the later work, this is disappearing a bit. Like now it just becomes more wraps that that act on the roof, and it's a bit more monolithic timber. Long debates about whether that should come back or not.
So just kind of final question on that topic. I imagine you could see yourself migrating away from a system of assembly, that is to say that the striated elements are actually constructed out of flat stock, to a cast composite, a lightweight system. No? I mean, yeah, because in other words, it raises the question, to what extent does the codification have to index something that's real or fictional?
Exactly, and that's this super thin line, right, with this thing. Like it's I don't know. In the lecture, I'm showing the tree trunk, and then an arrow, I'm showing the artificial tree trunk. So it's such a thin line between, like, kind of fiction and reality, right? Like, is this like actually a project that is about kind of deep tectonics, or is it actually all like millimeter thin cladding, right? And I think that's an interesting tension there. And yeah, I mean, I would like to, like I think that, I mean, my practice works a lot with timber for a lot of reasons. I mean, sustainable, it's easy to prototype, etc., etc. And we've accumulated a lot of knowledge about timber now. But it's not actually, I would say, like, it is also the discrete, or that body of work that I showed today should also be materially agnostic. Should be possible to do it in precast, in stone,
Of course.
in it should not be about the kind of it's not completely connected to timber.
It's not tied to an aesthetic. Okay,
Yeah.
so why don't we now open it up to some of the student questions? So if you guys have any particular interests, comments, inquiries that you would like to ask our guest speaker, feel free to type that in right away.
It looks like we've got questions both in the chat and the Q&A. I've tried to direct future questions to the chat.
Okay, I'm in the chat, but how come I can't see that? Robert, for some reason, the questions aren't showing up in my chat. Jill, do you see anything on your end?
Oh, there's one. I see one now. Could the speaker elaborate on his thoughts on craft? You got it? Yeah. Why?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh wow, there's a ton here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let me ask the questions and you can respond. I have two major questions. We will go from a meta question focusing on part economic, part politics. As you know, the thought of IP with our group has been thrown around. This, of course, has a construct against or anti-neoliberal agenda. But as I've argued before, the patent industry offer both the positioning of an idea in a democratic environment is more the later position of the product itself that becomes problematic. So as we look towards the part as an architectural position, not so much the whole as an intention, then the position of the architect changes into a more product developer's role, providing the unit for multi-changes and views, multiplicity of changes and views. Certainly, we could look at a redo of something like FLW's Reader's Digest plans, a new venue of Legos and architecture manifestation towards each part. Trying to get to the question. To be pointing on this, certainly we've had a conversation of smart blocks and Casey and Jose, et cetera. Where do you see the Retsin Lego moving in the idea of the smart block? Do you see a kit of different blocks, HVAC, electrical, et cetera? Pragmatic questions. Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that one. I mean, the question of authorship, I think is very interesting, like where the authorship resides. So technically speaking, the authorship, I would argue, resides in the relationship that is established between the parts, right? The kind of decision making that you make on the specific organization of those parts. So that would allow you to do a project. I mean, as we were talking about before, that would allow me to, for example, you know, the kind of square block module that we are developing. I mean, it's a box, right? There's no authorship in that like building element. It's a simple box. Of course, there's like engineering behind that box and like a lot of potential patents that you would have to do in the way that this box is constructed and assembled with robots and the way that it's engineered. But there's not a lot of, you could argue, not a lot of architectural authorship precisely in the box. But I would argue that when I would work with these boxes, and I've shown you like a few projects today, that the specific relations that I would develop between those boxes would kind of constitute my authorship, and I would be happy with other people messing around with those boxes as well, thinking that they would establish other positions and ideologies in their assemblies with these boxes, which is a little bit, I hinted at that by saying that the discrete, you know, is kind of agnostic in a way to these different ideologies. Like someone could be arranging that in a very kind of, you know, pedantic grid if they wanted to, right? And being kind of very, you know, or like organizing them in a very rigid way, while other people would maybe create very fuzzy agglomerations and aggregations of these things. So that's an interesting thing, I think, about authorship. The one, though, where it gets difficult is like, this works for the square block, but I think for the diamond block, which is very defining in a way for my work, the diamond block, I would not kind of freely distribute. Like I would, I feel like that block has design authorship like deeply embedded in it. And like that's something that I would not kind of distribute necessarily for others to kind of to play with, let's say. But with the square blocks, I mean, maybe the square block is also developed in a way for that reason, for the fact that, you know, it has so little kind of design intensity. It's so open and free that it could be kind of distributed. Like it's a more logical discrete block than the diamond block, I think. Yeah.
That's a good answer. Any other questions? I've got Ryan Manning, but I don't see anyone else.
Maybe you need to just scroll down the Q&A window so you can see the chat window. But there's questions in the chat.
Yeah, for some reason mine's locked down, Robert. Jill, do you see them on your end?
No, I see one that says, could the speaker elaborate on his thoughts on craft and why it's not important anymore? That seems like a nice question. I could take that one.
Yeah.
So I think so it's not that I'm arguing against, you know, making things well and sound and beautiful and like well constructed. I'm not against good details. I'm not against you know, good CNC cutting and you know, knowing how to make things. I think that's extremely important. But the thing that I'm arguing against is the kind of notion of craft itself. Like I think craft is something that implies small scale action and little kind of ideological or intellectual positioning. Like it's very innocent craft. And I think when you think about digital tools and technologies, I think craft is a kind of a dangerous path. And it has been used a lot in the past, in the early kind of 90s work. The idea of digital craft was very important for obvious reasons, right? And it made sense. But I think in today's environment, digital tools and digital technologies have really deep social and political implications. And I think we need to frame our kind of digital discourse around the notion, for example, like automation, which has to do then with immediately implies issues of labor and work and social and political consequences. So I'm not at all against craft, like you know, as the act of making beautiful things with your hands or with machines. But I think as a kind of framework for us as architects to operate in the digital, I think only talking about craft is dangerous because I think it disconnects us from really large societal implications of the digital. Like Uber and Google don't do craft, they do automation. And that's what we should be doing as architects. Otherwise, we will just be absorbed in a way by the Googles of this world.
Right. There's another question from Julie Mark Cohen. Maybe you can go to the bottom the use of brutalist style cantilevered floors, which you showed in your last slide, has been leading to one failure after another in the US. How do you reduce risk of structural failures?
Oh, I like the brutalist style there. So I don't know if you're aware. So Mario Carpo has nicknamed the Discrete as digital brutalist. Like he's been doing lectures under the heading of like digital brutalism. On the one hand, because of the kind of cantilevering, shard-like, chunky aesthetic, but also because brutalism was also kind of an architectural movement that was engaged in you know, societal questions, right? They were doing the work mainly through public work for governments, and housing work, and you know, it was a kind of the kind of last heydays of a kind of socially active modernism. So in that sense, like I like the use of like the term brutalist style. And in terms of like structural failures, I mean, I don't know in like, I mean, I don't know so much in the US, like, you know, how about construction or why brutalist cantilevers fail in the US. In London, at least, they hold up quite well, and it works fine. And I mean, I would say that like the work has like my work has been driven a lot through this notion of cantilevers, and it's very deliberate. Like you know, it's I don't like the idea to just follow gravity, like to do a dome. I find domes and vaults, I find them sad. I find it like, you know, we're just following like the logical thing to do. And I think the action of cantilevering, and I know there's a lot of people saying that it is like, you know, heroic modernism and it's so wrong because you're wasting material and like et cetera, et cetera. But I you know, I kind of like yeah, I'm attracted to the fact that we can have the freedom to cantilever, that we can defy the logical root of gravity, right? That we can do that, and I think that's important, because otherwise we're doing, I think, a very primitive kind of architecture where everything is kind of yeah, like we did so many efforts to escape pure gravity, you know, like architecture history has worked towards that. So yeah.
Yeah. No, the only thing I would add on that subject, Gilles, is that, and we spoke about this earlier in our discussion, is that one of the, I think the extraordinary balancing act you're dealing with is contradictions. So, you know, even the house that you didn't speak about with the lightweight column at the end, I mean, from certain vantage points, it looks like a Liszewski Brown, right? It's got this kind of fantastic utopian ascension, lifting off the ground into the sky, and yet the other side of your interest has to do with a kind of massive weight and monumentality. So gravity for you seems to be a kind of interchangeable part, if I use the
But
terminology.
it's also a strange thing. I mean, I didn't talk. You know, as usual, my lectures, they always like I always mess up my kind of schedule. So we didn't talk too much about the second chapter, technology.
Yeah.
Because I mean, in that second chapter, I'm talking basically about a bit more how I can add structure to piles, right? Because I was explaining how, you know, the natural state of a discrete system would be that the force is distributed in a homogeneous manner so that every part receives the same load. So that would lead to kind of blobby, blurry piles, right? And the projects that I do are not blobby, blurry piles. They're actually very precise and kind of, you know, the organization of the parts. And the way that we can do this, it's quite interesting, and it's quite an innovation as well. It doesn't actually kind of exist in timber technology. It's like we're constructing basically this stiff boxes, like timber boxes that are in themselves. You could call them flip invariant, so you can flip them in any direction, and they're fixed together under tension. So they post tension together. And normally post-tensioning is a technology that you would use in reinforced concrete with prefab. You would post-tension beams together, or you would embed tension cables into concrete slabs to deal with the cantilevering of the slab. In timber, it's not really done. Like it doesn't really exist in timber. There's only one experiment that was done at the ETH where post-tensioning is used in a timber structure. But for us, it was the logical way of kind of connecting these elements together because you're able to kind of distribute the force through the entire element. And at that moment, if you make use of post-tensioning, you can do these massive cantilevers with very little material. Like it's not actually wasteful in the system that we're using to do these like crazy cantilevers.
Right.
Like
right.
we just did. I think my AirPods are gonna go out, so I'm gonna switch my AirPods quickly.
Okay. I can't hear you now.
Yeah, so we just did I just came back from a building site in Bristol where we did, I don't know what that is in feet or in whatever imperial units, but we basically did, you know, huge cantilevers, kind of like 4 or 5 meters, just with like 12mm plywood, with really thin plywood, and it's you know perfectly engineered, can carry like a human being.
Right.
So it's very antithetical, but like through that kind of technology of post-tensioning, these stiff, lightweight boxes, these cantilevers are totally not a problem for the system. Like they're embedded in the kind of, it allows us to do this kind of strange assemblies that we're doing.
Hey, Gilles, I know it's well into the morning in Europe right now, and I just want to thank you for an extraordinary lecture on behalf of the entire school. I think you have an amazing practice, which I I think I communicated in a number of ways throughout the course of today's discussion. And I think the best work is yet to come. And we really, really look forward to it. So thank you for your generosity. A post-pandemic will actually bring you over in person and have an opportunity to see the newest work in the coming year or two.
That will be fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here online on Zoom. The worst part, by the way, Evan, is that tomorrow I'm teaching in Australia.
Are you ready?
I'm doing this late night lecture, and then I need to get up very early to do RMIT tomorrow morning. So,
Well, you've been extraordinarily generous, and we thank you.
yeah, fantastic.
And
Thank you so much.
Be the best.
Thank you, Evan. Bye.
Take care, my friend.